Ben, handing it off to you.
All right. I'll take it away from here. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Like Gary said, this is designing a system with object-oriented UX, or OOUX for short. So my name is Ben Pappalardo. I'm a senior UX designer at Insight. I've been actually working with Gary on the same project for the last several months, so that's been fun to get to know him and work across offices with some other consultants there. I'm in Columbus, Ohio. So let's get into it. I'm sure a lot of you being in UX have heard of Nielsen's UX laws. And you might recognize number 2 as being the match between the system and the real world. And what this law means is that the design should speak the user's language, use words, phrases, and concepts familiar to the user, rather than internal jargon. And it should follow real-world conventions, making information appear in a natural and logical order. So when you're designing a system, which is a particular type of solution that involves a lot of different moving parts, it might look something like this, and maybe this slide will make Gary chuckle, because this is what the project that I'm currently working on, this is what it seemed like when I first started working on it. There were a lot of words and terms and different jargons and actions that were being taken, and we kind of had to crunch all this into a coherent system. And I don't know about you guys, but when our instinct tends to be to start with an action. Say, hey, I'm going to start with, the add customer screen or the search screen or something like that. But OOUX says something different. Here's a quote from the founder of OOUX, Sophia Prater. She said, 3 or 4 years ago, I'd start by storyboarding a critical user path. I'd start with the doing. In retrospect, I feel like I was doing my job backwards for the first 2/3 of my career, putting interaction flows before building an object-oriented framework. How do the objects relate to one another? What content elements comprise each object? And finally, what objects does a user, or what actions does a user take on each object? So OUX says, hey, first step, let's not worry about the actions. Let's start with just the objects and try to make sense of it from there. And I love OUX. I actually tried to develop something very similar to tackle this client project. But when I started Googling, I found out that OUX already existed. And there was a woman traveling, going to conferences, kind of speaking about this exact same topic. And I'm excited to share that with you guys today if you haven't heard of it. But OOUX from the website defines it as a philosophy for designing digital systems that respects the fact that people think in objects and need consistent recognizable objects to understand an environment or product. And this is a picture of Sophia. I've actually recently connected with her on LinkedIn, and Insight is planning to get her to come and give a workshop to the UX team here at Insight. So we're really excited for that happening sometime in December. And Sophia's pioneering this philosophy and is providing solutions to problems that I've seen clients face. And I didn't feel like I had the adequate tools to solve these problems until now. So what does it mean that people think in objects? It means that when we see, systems like this that exist, it means that these aren't just screens, right? These are representations of objects in the real world. So for example, if you look at Flexport, which has actually redesigned their screen since I put this presentation together. You can see OOUX, or Flexport uses OOUX as the foundation for navigation. So if you could zoom in on their navigation, you can see that this system is built around these core objects of shipments, quotes, orders, bookings, products, networks, and reports. Similarly, Spotify uses OOUX to categorize their search results by object. So if you go on Spotify and listen to music, or navigate the system, every page you go to is going to be a song, an artist, an album, a playlist, a podcast, an episode, or a profile. Those are the core objects of Spotify. And even, kind of older apps that haven't updated yet, still are built around objects, customers, items, invoices, payments. So hopefully with those examples, you've kind of gotten a feel for what objects are, right? It's not a design system. It's not a component in a UI. It's a real world thing that people are coming to your app or site or system to view and consume. So every object, whether it be a shipment or a playlist, what have you, they have three things in common. They have relationships with other objects in the system. They're composed of content, which are attributes, metadata, or nested objects. And they have actions that a user can take on them. And you might be tracking, thinking, okay, this is all making sense. But why is this so hard to do given our current tools? So when we start out trying to map out a system, you might think, okay, information architecture, I'm going to build a sitemap. The problem with sitemaps is that they don't communicate the relationships between objects. They don't tell you what content that the objects are composed of, and they don't give you any clue of what actions you can take on these objects. And sitemaps were great for when companies were trying to put their sort of paper catalogs and paper documents on the web, but they seem to fall flat when you're trying to truly map out a system. So what OOUX says is that instead of a sitemap, we try something else. We make a relationship diagram and we make object models. So for the rest of this presentation, we're going to go through sort of a fake system and create a relationship diagram and an object model using the OOUX process. So the process has 4 steps, and they spell out ORCA. Step 1 is what are the objects in the problem space. Step 2 is what are the relationships among those objects. Step 3 is what content composes each object. And step 4 is which actions can be taken on each object. Let's see. And so we've already tested out music and international shipping and taking sales orders. So for our activity, we're going to do something that I bet none of you have ever done. It's a system about piñatas. And I'm kind of using this silly example to illustrate that it doesn't matter what kind of system it is. You can use the ORCA process to map out the objects, relationships, content, and actions for that system. So step 1, right? What are the objects? I guess at this point, I'll open it up to you guys and see if you can identify one or more objects that we'd want as part of our system. Just shout it out.
Candy.
All right, candy. There's one.
A bat.
The bat. Okay. Keep them coming.
The cardboard structure.
The piñata.
Sure.
Paper
The-
mache.
Rope to connect the pinata to the ceiling.
The rope. That's a good one. I did not think about the rope. That's a good one. So, and again, this is part of the fun of OOUX is there's no right or wrong answers. It's part of the interpretation of the designer or the research that you do to find those objects that are going to make up your system. So in this example, we have the piñata, the candy. I had the batter instead of the bat, but you could kind of track which bats are being used by which batters. And then finally, there's a tricky one in here that I think is important, and it's the swing. So every time a swing occurs, it's almost like a transactional object that you want that snapshot of. And so these are the four that we're going to use kind of in our example. So now that we've mapped out, or now that we've identified our core objects, let's move on to step 2, relationships. All right, again, this is an interactive slide. Can someone, what's the relationship between the piñata and the candy? Just in plain terms.
Falls out or holds it.
Yeah, contains it for a bit.
All right, yeah. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. I had the piñata contains the candy. Okay, so there's almost like a parent-child relationship going on there. What's the relationship between the candy and the batter?
They try to extract the candy. The
If
batter does.
If
they strike the piñata.
And I don't know. I had the batter can grab the candy if the piñata breaks.
Ah, okay.
Very similar, yeah. But this is part of what can go on, like in the workshop, like while you're, constructing a relationship diagram, like with your team. You can have these discussions, like how do we actually describe what's going on? Let's see. So then you can also say, the batter takes 3 swings. That's that relationship. Or the swing might hit and or break the piñata. And you can go into as much detail in these relationships as you want, sort of as far as it has to go. But just your project team having an understanding of these are the basic objects and here's how they're related in plain English is sort of what we're talking about when we say the relationship diagram. So now that everyone kind of understands, these relationships, we can move on to step 3, which is what are the content and actions? So the way that these are broke up is in the Orca process, Sophia has a different colored Post-it for each of these different content and actions. So she says actions are green, core content is yellow, metadata is red, and sort of nested objects are blue. And so I'll kind of take you through an example of how you could map out these Post-its onto these core objects. So for example, you might say the piñata in our system, our users may want to be able to add, edit, and delete piñatas. A piñata itself consists of a name, a photo, maybe it has hit points. Some piñatas are stronger than others. And maybe is it broken? And again, this is part of the discussion of the workshop. Like what is a piñata? Not to get too philosophical about it, but what content composes it? And then finally, some nested objects that you might want to be part of a piñata are like the batters who have hit the piñata, or maybe you want to track the batter who broke the piñata, and maybe the kind of candy that's inside of it. And the reason those are blue is because they are themselves core objects. So moving on, we might want to add, edit, and delete candy, track the brand of the candy, the pinata containing the candy. The batter might have more actions, right? The batter may have an action for grabbing the candy. The batter may have an action for swinging, in addition to adding, editing, and deleting. Maybe the batter has a name, a certain strength, and a photo. Here's our first example of metadata, where maybe like the batter's batting average, it's not core content because it's not something that can really be like edited, but it's sort of something that's calculated, or it's some objective data that's provided that we want to sort of track with that batter. And we got some nested objects, maybe the swing, whatever. I'll kind of skip this stuff. But at the end, you kind of see, okay, here are my core objects. Here are the actions I can take on each object. And then here's what composes each object. So you kind of have this 30,000 foot view of all the data that's sort of powering your app. Now you might be asking, like, what was the point of all that? Just get me in Sketch or Figma and let me, start designing out screens. Like, what's the point? Like this woman says in this article that I read preparing for this, like, of course we aren't creating these models solely as an analytical exercise. We want to use the model to improve design outcomes. And what it really gives us is a consistent representation of objects across the system. So what do I mean by that, right? You might get a user story that says, hey, as a user, I want to create a new pinata. So without OOUX, you're basically creating the pinata as you create the form to add a new pinata, right? You're doing two things at once. Whereas if you have your data model or your object model over here, you can say, okay, what does a user need to provide in order to create a pinata? Say, okay, it needs a name. If you look at the yellow Post-its, we need a photo. We need to plug in how many hit points it has and if it's broken or not. And we know that if the user enters these form fields, they will be creating what we have defined as a pinata to be. Let's try another example. Maybe you get another user story that says, as a user, I want to view all the pinatas. So again, if you don't have OOUX, you might be like, okay, maybe it's, tiles, or maybe it's a data table with all these columns that shows all the pinatas, right? But like, what data goes in there? I don't know. If you have your object model, you can say, okay, I know exactly what a pinata is. Let's make a list of pinatas. And each of the columns is one of the yellow Post-its. So we got the name, the photo, the hit points, is it broken or not? And then maybe some of the nested objects are columns too. Maybe we want to see who broke the pinata. So as we start to like put together these different screens that involve pinatas, we can see how they're all sort of driven off the same data model, the same object model. And any change to the model itself would have to ripple across all of these different representations of that object. Similarly, if you change one of these screens, right, say you add a form field on the add pinata screen, when I save that, where is it going to show up? Do I need to add a column to a table? Do I need to add like a tab to the view? Because underneath it all, a pinata is as we've defined it in the object model. Here's an example from Flexport, the app that I showed before, where here are 3 representations of a shipment. One of these representations is just a tiny bit of information on the dashboard. I call this the component UI, where a shipment is just a small component of a bigger screen. In the middle, we see one shipment is a row in a list of many shipments. And so we get a little bit more information about it. And then finally, in the detail UI, we see the detailed view of one specific shipment. And whether we're viewing the component UI, the browse UI, or the detail UI, they're all feeding off the same object model, right? They're all referring to the same real world thing. So think about what projects you're working on right now, right? Are you in the middle of designing a system right now? Or think about the systems that you use on a daily basis, like maybe like Spotify or Amazon or Twitter. Like what are the objects in those systems, right? Can you relate what we're talking about here to the work that you're doing? Can you visualize the relationships between them? Like what are they made of? And what actions can you take on them? I wasn't sure if I wanted to include this screen, but I'll describe it anyway. These are sort of the 5 representations of an object that you can have in a system. So like a browse UI is multiple instances of one object. An add UI is creating one instance of an object. The component UI is just a small part of an object that exists on another screen. A detail UI and an edit UI. And even though these are going to be different screens, maybe with different URLs, it's important to keep in mind that they're all referring to the same real world thing that has a data model. So where does OUX fit in? It might seem like, we already have so many UX activities, right? We're already doing research and we're, making task flow diagrams and task priority, and there's so much stuff that we already do. How is there room for this whole other thing? And so this might be what your current UX process looks like, where you have, maybe a discovery, an information architecture, you do some interaction design, you apply some visual design, and maybe a front-end prototype. And each of these has its own deliverable. So where OUX fits in is kind of in this front end here, where it's sort of half a discovery exercise and half your information architecture deliverables. So instead of maybe coming out with a report and a sitemap, you might leave your OUX workshop with object models and an object relationships diagram that then you can use to start putting together screen designs. And from Sophia's website, from rewiredux.com, this is one of the most convincing arguments for using OUX, is it improves the efficiency of the process. And she writes here that it allows developers to confidently get started on architecture before wireframes are even started. Designers and developers work on the object map together and then simultaneously work from the object map. No more design bottlenecks. This seems to plague every project I've ever been a part of, where sort of UX and development aren't starting on the same foundation, but creating these object models is actually not too far from thinking about databases and APIs and all that. And I've found that when I give this presentation to software developers, they sort of go like, oh yeah, this makes so much sense. Like this is how we think about it anyway. So it'll help you sort of bridge that gap between your development team as well. Here's one more quote from Sophia that I think really solidifies it. She says, if the objects in your product are inconsistent or unrecognizable, users will be confused. For example, in working with a large airline, we uncovered confusion around the difference between flights, trips, segments, and legs. Surprise, segments and legs are not the same. Neither are flights and trips. And wait, does the waiver apply to a flight, a segment, or a leg, or to the passenger? These concepts had not been properly untangled and mapped, and the unintuitive application reflected this lack of definition. So there really is a risk of, if we don't get this right, if you don't properly map out the objects in the system and how they're related, you could end up with something that really is undefined and does not solve the problem. So just in conclusion, hopefully I've made a good case for OOUX, that it can help design a system that matches the real world, and that starting the process with identifying this real world object and then creating the object model that then kind of permeates all of the screens that involve that object. I guess hopefully that gives you a better picture of how to better tackle designing a complex system, because we all know it's not easy. Yeah, so here were some excellent blog posts that I found helpful for this talk. And then if you're interested, I encourage you to check out either rewiredux.com or pursue actually getting certified in OOUX. And this is a real thing. You can pay money and get certified in a 10-week course. And yeah, I'm just excited about this topic, and I hope that this can be sort of your first step into learning more about it, and that you can start using it in your projects to better kind of untangle these complex information architecture problems. Happy OOUXing. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome.
Thank you. Good job.
Yeah, that's awesome. If anybody has any questions or anything,
I'd love to keep chatting about it if you guys have questions.
Hi, this is Frank. I have a question. I'm not sure this question will make sense. Hopefully it will. So typical systems like the ones that you've been using as examples, they have screens, they have different fields that you can fill in and all that sort of thing. And so if you were using OOUX, you would have, this model behind it to help you guys keep everything straight. So my question is, has anyone ever shown that model to the end user to help them get oriented on what the heck all this stuff is and how it relates? I mean, it might not be in a detailed fashion, but just some of the major relationships. Has anyone ever tried doing that? And if so, how did that turn out?
I guess I haven't. The model would have to be part of the experience somehow, right? It would have to be like part of the website or the application.
Right.
So maybe there is a way to have a graphic on the website that represents the object model or something like that. I think the more useful approach would be to bring users in to the modeling workshop and say like, hey, what do you come here for? What are the objects that you care about? And then sort of like, what actions do you want to take on these objects? Like what data points do you think about when you think about this object? So having them be part of the workshop building these deliverables, I think would be how the user gets involved.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Ben, have you done any? So back in like a couple years ago, I did a course on object modeling, which seems to be pretty tightly related to this, but was more of like a discovery session that would precede this. Have you looked at all into how those things kind of merge between like, because it definitely seems like this is where you take all that abstract like relationship data and then you kind of put it into, this is like more the translation of how it actually becomes a UI, right?
I mean, I think this also encompasses the object modeling workshop that you were talking about.
Okay.
So like you might not be able to, mock up all the screens in the workshop, like probably not. But once you have the object model, using it to help you design all the different representations of those objects consistently, is kind of where the value lies in that.
Gotcha. Yeah, nice. That makes sense.
So I'm curious as to why object-oriented design is mutually exclusive from site mapping. I would think intuitively that site mapping might help to preserve some sort of organization, while object-oriented design might help to, I guess, keep content more consistent. They could work hand in hand. Is there something that I'm not understanding?
Ooh, good question. Let me think about that. Are they mutually exclusive? So when you create a sitemap, what you're saying is, I think these are the pages or these are the screens that need to exist. But when you create object models and object relationships, you're not tying yourself to saying this is a screen and this is a screen and this is a screen. Like for example, like you might want a screen that compares two objects together, right? In which case, like that would be a page in the sitemap, but it would be using data from two separate objects. So I guess that was one of the limitations I found when trying to do systems information architecture on sitemaps, was that I felt like I had to commit too early to what the pages were going to be.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, where in objects, like you might say, I have this object called a piñata, but maybe you never actually get to view a piñata on a page, right? Maybe you only view it as part of a swing or as a batter, but I still know that this object exists within the system.
Mm-hmm. I see.
Something else, like maybe like a notification is a good example of something where there's not going to be a page on your sitemap that says like notifications. There could be. But you might miss that object if you were only looking at what the screens were going to be and not what the objects moving around the system were going to be.
Ah, okay, I get it. So sitemaps kind of put the cart before the horse.
Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. Mm-hmm. I mean, but again, like it might be the right tool if you're simply like cataloging digital content, or creating a library of resource, like Wikipedia, use a sitemap. You know what I mean? But for something with all this interaction and moving parts and cause and effect relationships, like a true system, a sitemap falls short, I think.
Okay, great.
Yeah, great question.
I got a question for you. This is Susan. So at what point in the process, so you have all these objects that you've mapped out. Where do you bring in the discussion about different users, their user stories, and like how they might interact with each of these objects slightly differently than each other? So like an admin, like roles-based type stuff, or just like how if you were doing a system that was for education, you have like students interact differently than teachers, that interact differently than maybe administrators at a school or something like that. Like, do you do the objects first? Do you do the user stories first? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I haven't looked too much into this, but that's a more sort of advanced topic that Sophia gets into in her content, where she talks about like for each user role, you basically have to go through all the objects again and say, you know, this person can see the price of the thing, this person can't, or this person can see, you know, this piece of content and this person can't. So that's sort of like a level on top of the object maps, where you say for this role, here are the object maps, for this role, here are the object maps. And then the same kind of thing happens for, and not to scare anybody away, but this is really how complicated some of these systems are, is the objects change based on what status they're in, right? So for example, you might have a sales order that has not been sent to the customer. And then once the sales order has been sent to the customer, maybe a field gets added or removed or a button appears, right? And then when the sales order gets paid, maybe another value appears, and another button appears, and another button disappears. So these objects also exist in different states as well as all of that also being seen at multiple user roles with different permissions. So yeah, great question. There's a lot to it. And it might seem complicated, but you know, this is the easiest way to do it.
Does she go into any like tooling around how to capture all of that in a team setting? Is it more like a big whiteboard, or is it just, I know you said Post-its for certain parts of it. Like what are the tools that she thinks are the most useful for this?
Oh man, another great question. So for the workshop, she does use Post-its when she can be in person, or she uses like Mural. Since COVID, she's been doing like Mural workshops, where you can still kind of get the feeling like you're moving Post-its around. I'm actually going to try to collaborate with her and potentially build a custom tool for capturing all this stuff. I know she's got like spreadsheets and like Word documents and things like that. I'm actually looking forward to hearing her lecture and like getting the workshop in December to try to get more of the inside scoop on that. But I think there's still room for like an OUX tool to be created that like better captures everything in a like readable way.
Yeah, I think my wall would get like really full very quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even if you can't, you know, go through the formal motions of all of this, I've found that just kind of thinking in this way, like sometimes like you can take some mental shortcuts and say like if you have a deadline, you can just be like, all right, you know, get the BA on the phone. What are the objects? Okay, write them down. All right, what is each object composed of? Okay, you know, put some bullet points under that. What actions do I have to put on each one? You know, draw some buttons on the screen. Okay, at least I know sort of what I'm on the hook for, as opposed to kind of going in blind and not having a sort of systematic approach for like getting the requirements.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, anybody else have any other questions for Ben or for in UX in general, I guess? Cool. David, anything else you wanna add?
Great job, Ben. That was awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, David.
When's he coming back?
Yeah. Wait, when's who coming back?
Ben, for the next talk.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know. I'll have to actually do some OUX and let you know if it works.
Cool. All right. Well, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to like stick around and ask them, or send an email, or on Twitter, or whatever. But thank you very much, Ben, for teaching us all about object-oriented UX. I think that was awesome and should be very helpful, especially for a lot of the enterprise people or internal tool people, most likely. So, which is me. So
Exactly. Yep.
yeah.
And like for everybody on the phone too, like I encourage you to go check out like Rewired UX, and there's like a podcast and a meetup. Like Sophia's producing a lot of great content in this area. So if you're interested in learning more, go hear it from the person who invented it. She could probably speak much more clearly about it than I can. So
Yeah, for sure, will do. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining, and hopefully we will see you soon for another IXDA Triangle meetup.
Thank you.
Yay.
Good job, Ben. Enjoyed it.
thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Good job, Ben. There we go. Great.